I still remember the night everything changed. The night I saw it with my own eyes and my heart broke into pieces I didn't know could exist. I had just come home from my night shift at the hospital, exhausted, my scrubs still smelling faintly of antiseptic and coffee, when I noticed his phone buzzing relentlessly on the kitchen counter. Michael never left it out like that. I walked closer, half annoyed, half curious, and my stomach dropped as I saw the screen light up with her name. Not a friend, not a coworker, not anyone I had ever met, her. And the messages weren't casual. The words were intimate, flirty, full of a secret I hadn't been invited to. My hands trembled, my chest tightened, and I felt this cold, sinking emptiness that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, cry, throw the phone across the room, but I just stood there frozen, watching him scroll, oblivious to my breaking heart standing right behind him. And in that moment, I realized I didn't know the man I had married, the man who promised me forever. I remember those first few years with Michael like a blur of laughter, shared coffee mornings, and quiet Sunday afternoons where nothing felt heavy or broken. And I could almost forget the bills stacking up or the rising rent that seemed impossible to keep up with in our small apartment in Denver, Colorado, a city we had both fallen in love with for its skyline and weekend hikes, its farmers markets and endless brunch spots where we pretended to be carefree even though my job as an ER nurse left me drained more days than not, and Michael's work in IT support barely paid for the luxuries we wanted, the little vacations, the dinners out, the occasional splurge on a smart speaker or the latest phone just to feel like life was ours, like we were keeping up with everyone else on Instagram, smiling for photos that didn't show the exhaustion or the tension that sometimes sat at the edge of our living room like an invisible guest, waiting for one small thing to ignite it. We had routines that made life predictable and, for a while, comforting. I'd wake up before dawn to pack my uniform and sip my overly sweet coffee while Michael still slept, his phone by the nightstand, his soft snores filling the silence. He'd roll over eventually, mumbling something about dreams he couldn't remember, and we'd hug before he rushed to work, just like every morning. Just like every morning I thought nothing could break the fragile peace we had built together. On weekends, we would try to make up for the sleep we lost during the week, wandering through Target or the grocery store, sometimes laughing at ridiculous sales or arguing over which type of cereal was better, those small, silly disagreements that now feel almost nostalgic, like the last warm rays of a sun that's gone. Our friends thought we had it all together. Social media painted us as a happy couple, our posts filled with smiles and sunsets and hashtags that screamed contentment, while reality was quietly wearing at the edges of my heart. The late nights at work, the constant exhaustion, the way Michael sometimes stared at his laptop a little too long with a subtle tension in his shoulders I didn't understand. It all seemed small at first, insignificant in the grand picture of a life we were building. I ignored the quiet unease, telling myself it was stress, that life was hard for everyone, that maybe one day we'd finally feel like we were on the same page, breathing the same air, walking the same path together. There were hints, though, little things I couldn't shake. His phone always seemed to have a new notification waiting, a message from someone he said was a coworker or an old friend, but the way he would stiffen when I asked, the slight avoidance in his eyes, it made me pause, wondering if I was imagining things, if I was just too tired, too worn down by work, too sensitive to notice patterns that weren't really there. I'd shake it off, blaming my overthinking, convincing myself that marriage wasn't about suspicion, that love was about trust, even when something in my gut whispered otherwise, a quiet voice I chose to ignore in favor of the life I wanted to believe we still had. We fought sometimes, of course, but nothing catastrophic, nothing that left scars bigger than bruises that healed overnight. Arguments about money, about chores, about the future, about me working nights and him taking care of groceries, about what we could afford for Christmas, all of it seemed normal. I thought normal was safe, that if we had the mundane, we were okay. Yet, late at night, after a 12-hour shift and the apartment silent except for the hum of the fridge and the occasional car driving past, I would sometimes catch him staring at his phone, scrolling for minutes that felt like hours, and I would feel a prickle of unease I didn't know how to name. I chalked it up to tiredness, the kind of worry that sticks to you when your life is built on schedules, bills, and commitments that feel heavier than the love you started with, heavier than the laughter we had shared in our first small apartment that smelled of new paint and old carpet. Friends and family called us the perfect couple, the one people envied, the two people who seemed to get it right while everyone else stumbled. And I wanted to believe that, wanted to believe in the image we projected, in the photos we posted, in the life we told ourselves we had, because the alternative, thinking that something was quietly fraying beneath the surface, was too terrifying to face. I would brush off the way he sometimes flinched at my touch, the way he seemed distracted in conversations, the way he would check his watch during dinner and slip away to the bathroom with his phone as if there was a world he didn't want me to see. I pretended it was work, that it was stress, that it was life, until one night, that one night I can never forget, the illusion shattered completely. By the time that night came, I was exhausted in every possible way, my body heavy, my mind foggy, my heart unknown unknowingly preparing for a storm it hadn't yet realized was coming. The night shift, the bills, the rent due next morning, the emails from my supervisor about covering extra shifts, the constant pressure of life in 2024 America with rent climbing higher than my paycheck, groceries costing more than I could budget, and a marriage I thought was steady, all collided into a single, fragile thread of reality. And when I walked into the kitchen and the phone lit up with her name, the thread snapped, leaving me staring at a life that looked the same on the surface but was completely unrecognizable underneath. It was the first time I realized that the man who shared my bed, who held my hand, who promised forever, might have been slowly slipping away from me all along, hiding secrets I never wanted to imagine, building walls around our life while I believed we were building it together. It started subtly, a small crack in the life I had thought was solid, something I tried to ignore at first because I was exhausted, because life was busy, because I wanted to believe the man I married would never hurt me on purpose. Michael's laughter at dinner felt forced, the way his eyes darted to his phone before he answered me, the soft sighs he hid when I spoke about my day, all of it felt different, like there was a weight I couldn't touch pressing between us. One evening, I came home earlier than usual, hoping to surprise him with a hot meal and a quiet house for us to decompress after long days, and I found him on the couch, phone in hand, eyes glued to the screen, a smile on his lips that wasn't meant for me. My chest tightened immediately, that familiar sinking feeling returning with force, and I froze in the doorway, pretending I didn't notice, pretending that I hadn't seen the messages, the way he typed carefully, like he knew someone else was waiting on the other end. I tried to speak casually, asking about his day, about work, about the neighbor's dog barking all afternoon, anything to fill the silence, anything to push past the dread building in my stomach. But he seemed distracted, his laughter hollow, his attention fleeting. When he finally looked up, his eyes flicked over mine for a split second, a fleeting guilt, or maybe annoyance, I couldn't tell which, and then he looked away again. That night, I stayed up late in our bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city below, thinking about every little thing I had ignored, every small red flag I had brushed off as stress or fatigue, realizing too late that those signs weren't coincidences. They were warnings, quiet alarms that I had been too tired, too distracted, too hopeful to notice. The next morning, I tried to talk to him, to ask the questions that burned in my mind, but the words caught in my throat. I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to scream at the unfairness of it all, but instead, I forced myself to smile, to pack my scrubs for work, to pretend I was okay while the truth sat like a heavy stone pressing against my chest. At the hospital, every patient I cared for, every emergency I handled, every life I touched felt distant, like I was living someone else's day, moving through it in a daze while my own life unraveled in silence back home. I couldn't sleep that night, pacing our apartment, touching objects he had touched, trying to find some clue, some reason, some explanation that would make sense of the betrayal I already knew was real. Days passed with small, unnoticeable lies that piled on top of each other, building a wall I couldn't scale. He would say he was working late, he would claim the messages were harmless, just coworkers joking around, but my heart knew the truth in ways my mind didn't yet want to admit. I began noticing patterns I had once overlooked, the way he left the room when his phone buzzed, the way he avoided eye contact when I asked about plans, the way he sometimes dressed nicer for nights out that he insisted were mandatory work events. I felt like I was losing him, like a version of him I had never known was hiding behind the life we built together, quietly dismantling it while I clung to the illusion of normalcy. It wasn't dramatic at first, no shouting matches, no confrontations, just this quiet, gnawing suspicion that poisoned every interaction. I found myself checking his phone once, twice, feeling the shame and panic mixed together, but each time discovering the same truth, messages, screenshots, conversations that weren't mine to see, and yet impossible to ignore. Every word was a knife, every notification a reminder that the man I trusted, the one who kissed me goodbye every morning, might be slipping further and further away into a life that didn't include me. I tried to talk to friends about it, carefully, tentatively, hiding names, hiding details, afraid of judgment, afraid of exposing a truth I wasn't ready to face myself. They told me to breathe, to trust, to not jump to conclusions, but I couldn't. My gut screamed in ways that no logical reasoning could calm. I felt unmoored, like I was walking through fog, unsure which path was real, unsure if I would find the man I loved beneath the stranger he had become. Each night, I cried quietly in the bathroom, the mirror reflecting my bloodshot eyes, the same mirror I had once smiled into, full of hope, full of love, now staring back at someone exhausted, betrayed, and alone, even when he was just in the next room. The tension escalated without a single word being exchanged, the silence between us thick and heavy, the home I had loved feeling suddenly unfamiliar. I realized that betrayal isn't always loud, that it doesn't always come crashing down in a single moment. Sometimes it creeps in, quiet and insidious, wrapping itself around your life until everything familiar feels like a lie. And that's exactly what I felt, a quiet storm, a betrayal that didn't announce itself with drama, just with the subtle subtle unraveling of trust, with the hollow eyes across the table, with the laughter that didn't reach him, with the small glances at a screen that suddenly mattered more than anything we had shared. I began to watch him, carefully, silently, not out of obsession but out of a desperate need to know, to understand, to prepare for what I couldn't yet face. I kept a journal, writing down every small oddity, every lie, every half-truth, thinking that maybe if I documented it, I could make sense of the chaos. Maybe I could protect myself from the heartbreak I already sensed was inevitable. I didn't know it yet, but that was the night my life started to tilt. The night I realized that the man I had married could change in ways I never imagined, in ways that no love, no hope, no patience could stop if I didn't act carefully and decisively. The days after the first betrayal were suffocating, each one heavier than the last, filled with moments that felt normal to everyone else but torturous to me. A constant gnawing ache in my chest that no coffee, no distraction, and no shallow conversation could ever fix. I started noticing how exhausted I had become, how my hands shook slightly when I held a cup of coffee, how my smile had become forced, how even my laughter with friends felt hollow, like an echo of a life I once had before the suspicion crept into every corner of our apartment. Michael went about his routine, smiling, talking, brushing his hair back, looking like the man I married, but I could feel the invisible wall rising between us, cutting through the warmth we had shared, slicing through every quiet comfort, leaving only unease, and the fear that I was slowly losing him to someone I didn't even know. Every interaction with him became a minefield. Simple questions about dinner, about bills, about errands felt loaded, and I could see it in the subtle shift of his expression, the tightening of his jaw, the way he avoided eye contact. My mind spun constantly, analyzing every word, every glance, every tiny gesture, trying to find patterns, clues, anything that could explain why the man who promised forever seemed to be slipping into a world that didn't include me. Evenings were the worst, when the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint glow of the city lights outside, because it was then that the silence screamed the loudest, when the small lie of a work event or overtime would echo in my mind, making me question every memory, every promise, every shared dream. I tried to cope by immersing myself in work, taking extra shifts, volunteering for the busiest nights, anything to drown out the thoughts that threatened to consume me. But even at work, the exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a heavy weight pressing on my chest, making it hard to focus on patients, hard to breathe between the beeping monitors, hard to pretend I was functioning normally while my heart was fractured into pieces that no one could see. My colleagues noticed my quietness, the way I flinched at small noises, the way I sometimes stared blankly at the ceiling after a long procedure, and I would force a smile, mumble something about sleep deprivation, but inside, I felt like a stranger in my own life, watching the world move in rhythm while I stumbled, trying to catch up, trying to survive. The bills started piling up, as they always do, and suddenly every envelope, every notification, every rent reminder became another source of pressure, a reminder that life didn't wait for heartbreak. Inflation had made groceries more expensive, rent had increased again, and I felt trapped between wanting to leave and needing to survive, to make sense of a life that seemed to be unraveling faster than I could hold it together. Michael's avoidance intensified. He would come home late, sometimes smelling faintly of perfume I didn't recognize, sometimes with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, and I felt myself shrinking, retreating into the corners of our shared space, afraid to confront him directly because I didn't yet have the strength, the proof, or even the courage to face the man I loved and accuse him of tearing our life apart. I found myself crying in the car more than once, gripping the steering wheel while parked outside the grocery store, the tears streaming down my face in the glow of the streetlights, feeling both ridiculous and helpless at the same time. I would think of our life together, of the small joys that had once defined us, of the Saturday mornings with pancakes and laughter, of the trips to the mountains, of the quiet evenings watching Netflix, and I would realize that all of that was now fragile, delicate, and possibly gone forever. It was a grief I couldn't name because nothing had ended yet, nothing had been confronted, but the loss was already eating at me from the inside, leaving me hollow, exhausted, and terrified. Sleep became nearly impossible. I would lie awake listening to his footsteps, the faint buzz of his phone, imagining the conversations I couldn't see, the messages I couldn't read, the moments I wasn't included in. The apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a cage, every familiar object a reminder of what had been, what could be, and what I was slowly realizing might never return. I began to plan quietly, meticulously, recording the oddities, saving receipts, taking screenshots of messages I suspected, not out of obsession, but out of necessity, a desperate attempt to regain control over a life that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Even our friends noticed the tension, the subtle shift in our dynamic, but I would laugh it off, brush it aside, make excuses about work stress, about sleep deprivation, about life being busy. No one knew the full extent of what I suspected, the quiet betrayal gnawing at me every second, the way I felt like I was drowning while pretending to float. Every smile felt like a lie, every conversation conversation a performance, every glance a silent question I didn't yet dare to ask. The weight of it all pressed on me constantly, and I began to realize that life as I knew it was no longer mine to navigate freely. It belonged to the hidden truths, to the unspoken betrayal, to the quiet unraveling that was happening behind my back while I tried desperately to hold on. By the time the week ended, I felt broken in ways I didn't know were possible. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental, spiritual. I began questioning my judgment, my choices, my ability to trust anyone, even myself. I realized that betrayal doesn't just hurt, it isolates, it confuses, it robs you of certainty, leaving you stranded in a world where nothing is what it seems, where every familiar sound, every small routine, every shared space is tainted with doubt. And that's exactly where I found myself, trapped in a life I had built with my own hands, in love with a man who had become a stranger, and facing a storm I didn't yet know how to survive. It was a quiet Thursday night when everything I had been quietly fearing finally became undeniable, the moment I had dreaded but also somehow needed, as if my heart demanded the truth even when my mind begged me to ignore it. I had returned early from my shift again, telling myself it was just coincidence, just another tired attempt to keep some semblance of normal life, but as soon as I opened the front door, the unmistakable sound of laughter reached my ears, a low, intimate laugh that wasn't meant for me, and my chest tightened so sharply it felt like my ribs were pressing inward, trying to squeeze the panic right out of me. I froze in the hallway, listening to the conversation from the living room, my pulse hammering in my ears, my hands shaking uncontrollably as the realization hit me all at once. Michael wasn't just hiding small flirtations, or harmless messages, or distracted work calls. He had been living a secret life I had no part in, a life where I was already an outsider, invisible, irrelevant. I crept closer, my breath shallow, and my eyes caught the glow of his phone on the coffee table, notifications piling up from a woman whose name now felt like poison on my tongue. And then I saw it. Photos, messages, videos, evidence that everything I had suspected was true and far worse than I had imagined. This wasn't an emotional affair hidden behind vague texts. This was deliberate, repeated, intimate, a betrayal so real that my stomach churned, my vision blurred with tears I couldn't stop, and my body felt heavy as if gravity itself was punishing me for the naive trust one had given too freely. I sank onto the edge of the couch, clutching the cushions, my mind screaming, my heart breaking, trying to comprehend how the man who kissed me good morning, who promised forever, could be capable of this quiet, calculated deception. For a long moment, I just watched, numb and hollow, as he typed another message, laughed again softly, and scrolled through conversations that had nothing to do with me. And I realized that every instinct I had tried to ignore, every flicker of unease, every sleepless night spent wondering, had been right. The betrayal wasn't minor. It wasn't forgivable with a simple apology or a forced conversation. It was deliberate, constant, a secret life that he had constructed carefully while I continued to pay the bills, work my shifts, and maintain the home that he now treated as if it were just a backdrop to someone else's story. I felt rage and grief swirl together, a violent storm inside me that I could neither release nor contain, leaving me trembling in silence, wondering how I could have been so blind, so trusting, so foolish. That night I didn't confront him. I didn't yell. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't throw plates or scream, because in that moment, I realized confrontation wouldn't save me. It would only give him power over my pain. Instead, I took photos, screenshots, and notes, documenting everything meticulously, my hands shaking as I typed, every tear a reminder that this was real, that the man I loved had been hiding, lying, and betraying me in ways I could never have anticipated. I felt like I was both mourning the marriage I thought I had and preparing myself for the fight I knew I would have to face to protect what was left of my dignity, my sense of self, and my future. Sleep didn't come that night. Not really. I paced the apartment, phone in hand, heart racing. The apartment once familiar and safe now feeling like a trap, every shadow and object reminding me of his duplicity. I thought about every shared memory, every promise, every whispered I love you, wondering which ones had been genuine and which ones had been carefully constructed lies. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it felt physical, a sickness in my bones, a hollow ache in my chest, a weight pressing down that left me gasping for air even when I stood still. I cried quietly, clutching the sheets, whispering his name to myself, wishing he could see what he had done, wishing I could wake up from this nightmare, wishing somehow it wasn't true. By morning, I realized something profound. The man I had married, the life I thought we were building together, didn't exist anymore, at least not in the way I had believed. He had chosen someone else in secret, someone invisible to the world but central in his private life, and that knowledge changed everything. My heart was shattered, but my mind began to focus, slowly, deliberately, recognizing that while I could not undo the betrayal, I could decide what to do next, how to reclaim control over my life, how to survive without him consuming my every thought. That realization, fragile and painful, was the first step toward quiet strength, the first glimmer of hope amid the wreckage. It was also the night I finally understood that betrayal is not just a moment. It is a pattern, a choice repeated over time, and recognizing it is the only way to stop it from defining your life. I knew I had to be strategic, to act with dignity, to preserve myself, and to find a way forward without letting anger or despair consume me completely. I sat in the living room long after dawn, watching the city wake below our window, feeling like a stranger in my own life, but also feeling a spark of clarity, the beginning of a plan, the awareness that while I could not change him, I could choose my own path, my own survival, my own story, and that knowledge, however painful, was a lifeline. After the truth hit me like a tidal wave, I realized screaming or confronting Michael in anger wouldn't serve me. It would only give him the satisfaction of seeing me broken, and I refused to give him that power. Instead, I started moving quietly, deliberately, treating every day like a chess game where my emotional survival depended on strategy and patience. I created a journal, a meticulous record of messages, dates, and behaviors, each entry a reminder that I wasn't imagining things, that I had proof, and that one day, this evidence might be the key to reclaiming my life. Every text, every lie, every late-night disappearance was catalogued, not out of obsession, but as armor against the chaos he had created. I also began to reclaim my own space in ways that didn't require confrontation. I woke earlier than usual, making coffee for myself, listening to podcasts that reminded me of my worth, and walking through the city streets on my lunch breaks, breathing in the crisp morning air as if I could inhale clarity and exhale the heartbreak. I started spending more time with friends again, carefully choosing people who grounded me, who reminded me that my life didn't have to revolve around his choices or his betrayal. Even small things, like rearranging the apartment or buying a plant I had always wanted, became acts of silent rebellion, tangible reminders that I was still in control of at least some part of my world. Financial independence became another focus. Michael had always handled certain bills, certain payments, and I realized that even though we were married, I couldn't let my security be tied to someone who had already demonstrated they could betray me without remorse. I opened a separate account in my name, started saving aggressively, and researched ways to protect my future, quietly planning for a life where I wouldn't have to depend on him, where I could walk away without fear of losing everything I had worked for. Every deposit, every small investment felt like reclaiming a piece of my dignity, a silent but firm statement that I would survive this without crumbling. I also practiced emotional control. I refused to cry in front of him, refused to beg for explanations or apologies, refused to show him that he still had the ability to hurt me publicly. Instead, I cried in the car, in the bathroom, in the quiet of my bedroom, alone with my thoughts, letting the grief and rage pass through me without giving him the satisfaction of witnessing my pain. I journaled my feelings in long, messy paragraphs, poured over every moment of betrayal, but always ended with reminders to myself: I am stronger than this. I will not let this define me. I am not powerless. These words became my mantra, my shield, and my fuel. Even my interactions with him changed subtly. I became calm, polite, but distant, like a mirror reflecting the person he had chosen to be rather than the one I had once loved. I asked questions in neutral tones, listened without emotion, and observed without judgment, making mental notes, cataloging every movement, every lie, every subtle sign of guilt or indifference. It was exhausting, but it was necessary, because every encounter was an opportunity to gather clarity, to protect myself, to build strength quietly while he remained oblivious to the inner storm I was weathering. I also started thinking about the long term, not just emotionally but legally and practically. I researched divorce laws in Colorado, read about property rights, custody considerations, and financial protections, all while keeping my intentions private. I spoke to a few close friends in confidence, careful to preserve anonymity, and slowly began to see a path where I could emerge from this betrayal intact, empowered, and unbroken. Planning became a form of therapy, a way to channel the anger and heartbreak into something constructive, something that would eventually give me control over a life that had suddenly felt so uncertain. Every small act, every calculated move, gave me back a piece of myself I had thought was lost. I realized that quiet strength often works better than loud confrontation, that patience is a weapon when wielded carefully, and that reclaiming control doesn't require him to admit guilt or apologize. It only requires me to believe in my own power and refuse to let the betrayal define me. The more I acted, the more I felt a shift inside, a growing sense that I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing to thrive, even if it meant leaving behind the man I had once loved more than anything. By the end of that month, I had transformed my despair into action. I felt calmer, sharper, and more grounded than I had in weeks, aware of every step he took, every secret he kept, and every lie he told, but refusing to let them dominate my life. I had found a quiet dignity in planning my future, a subtle but powerful reclamation of my identity. Michael's choices had hurt me deeply, but they had also forced me to recognize my own strength, my resilience, and my capacity to protect myself emotionally, financially, and mentally. I was no longer just a victim of betrayal. I was a woman quietly preparing to rise, a woman who knew knew that the next steps would define her life far more than his mistakes ever could. The day finally came when I couldn't stay silent any longer, not because I wanted revenge, but because the weight of the lies, the betrayal, and the quiet torment had become unbearable, and I needed closure, clarity, and a sense of control over my own life. I remember standing in the kitchen, the same space where months of doubt, suspicion, and heartbreak had silently grown like cracks in the walls, looking at Michael with eyes I barely recognized as my own, sharp and steady, devoid of fear, carrying the quiet power of someone who had survived a storm and refused to be swept away by it. He looked at me, confused at first, then defensive, and I felt a surge of calm determination, knowing that the confrontation would not be loud, not dramatic, but devastating in its quiet truth. I laid the evidence on the table with screenshots, messages, photos, dates, every small lie documented meticulously, not to humiliate him but to reveal the reality he had tried to hide. I watched him shift, realizing that the casual arrogance he had maintained for months was slipping, replaced by a flicker of guilt, panic, and perhaps the first true fear he had felt in a long time. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I didn't beg, because I had learned that showing emotion would only give him power over my pain. Instead, I spoke calmly, each word deliberate, each phrase carrying the weight of betrayal, disappointment, and quiet strength, letting him feel the gravity of his choices without me having to raise my voice. The most powerful moment wasn't in my words, but in my silence, the pauses between sentences where the truth lingered in the air like smoke, where he had to face the full impact of everything he had done, without excuses or distractions. I saw the shift in him, the recognition that he had underestimated me, underestimated my capacity to survive, to observe, to reclaim my life, and it was intoxicating in a quiet, controlled way. I felt a strange relief wash over me, a mixture of heartbreak and liberation, realizing that this confrontation wasn't just about him. It was about me taking back the narrative of my own life, refusing to be defined by his deception. I didn't need an apology, and I didn't ask for one. What I needed was acknowledgement of reality, the recognition that I had seen through the lies, and that my life, my choices, and my dignity mattered more than the betrayal I had endured. And when he finally spoke, fumbling for words, trying to explain or justify, I realized that none of it mattered. I had already moved past the emotional hold he had on me, and the power that once belonged to him, his ability to hurt, manipulate, or control, was gone. It was my storm, and I had weathered it, stronger than before. That confrontation changed everything. For the first time in months, I felt free, not in the sense that the pain had vanished, but in the sense that I had reclaimed my agency, my voice, and my life. I had confronted the betrayal, faced the truth, and emerged with a dignity he could not take from me. The apartment felt lighter, the air cleaner, and even though the heartbreak remained like a scar, it was no longer a chain. It was a reminder of my strength, a symbol of resilience, and a testament to the quiet power that comes from surviving a storm without losing yourself in the process. Afterwards, I began to think clearly about what I needed to do next, not out of anger or spite, but out of necessity. I began to plan for my future, to prioritize myself, to rebuild the life that had been quietly eroded over months of betrayal. Every step I took, every decision I made, carried the confidence of someone who had stared heartbreak in the face and refused to be consumed by it, someone who understood that dignity and strength often speak louder than confrontation or revenge. That moving forward with grace is the ultimate statement of power, and in that quiet, unspoken moment, I realized that the climax wasn't about him, or even about the betrayal. It was about me, my resilience, my ability to survive, and my commitment to reclaiming a life that is mine entirely, free from deception, free from manipulation, and free from the illusion of the man I thought I knew. It was the moment where heartbreak became empowerment, where betrayal became clarity, and where the past, no matter how painful, could finally be left behind as I stepped into the future I was determined to claim. The days after the confrontation were quieter than I expected, but in that quiet, I found something I hadn't felt in months: clarity. The heartbreak was still there, raw and jagged, but it no longer controlled me, and I realized that survival wasn't about forgetting what happened, it was about choosing to live fully despite it. I started small, setting routines for myself that reminded me I existed outside of his choices and his deception. I walked through the city streets in the early mornings, coffee in hand, feeling the crisp air on my face, allowing myself to notice the world again, to feel sunlight on my skin, to breathe without the constant weight of suspicion pressing down on me. Each step felt like reclaiming a fragment of the life he had tried to overshadow. I also reconnected with friends who had quietly drifted away, spending evenings in laughter and conversation, realizing that community could heal what betrayal had tried to destroy. I signed up for yoga classes, joined a book club, and even started journaling in a more intentional way, not just to record evidence or track his lies, but to explore my own thoughts, dreams, and desires that had been buried under months of fear and doubt. I discovered a strength I didn't know I had, a calm resilience that came from surviving pain and refusing to be defined by it, and it became intoxicating in a quiet, empowering way. Financial independence became central to my recovery. I consolidated savings, budgeted carefully, and researched ways to invest in my future, making sure that no betrayal could ever leave me vulnerable again. Each small deposit, each careful decision, each practical step gave me confidence and a sense of control that felt foreign but exhilarating. It wasn't revenge, it was reclamation, the steady rebuilding of a life that had been quietly threatened, and it was profoundly satisfying to realize that I was capable of supporting myself and thriving on my own terms. I also took care of my emotional health in ways I had neglected. I allowed myself to cry without guilt, to feel sadness without shame, and to process anger without letting it consume me. Therapy sessions became a lifeline, a space where I could untangle the messy, conflicting emotions that had dominated my life for months. I slowly began to see myself not as a victim of betrayal, but as someone who had endured it, who had faced the storm with courage, and who was now choosing to rise stronger, wiser, and more self-aware than ever before. Every small victory, walking past his favorite cafe without flinching, not reacting when his messages went unanswered, laughing at something that reminded me of a happier past, felt monumental. I realized that the true power of moving forward wasn't in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in quietly reclaiming every aspect of my life that had been overshadowed by betrayal. It was about taking control of my environment, my emotions, and my future, proving to myself that no one else's choices could dictate the value of my existence or the trajectory of my life. And as I began to rebuild, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I walked taller, spoke with more confidence, and smiled more freely, even when he was around. The air around me felt lighter, the apartment brighter, and my own presence more commanding in ways that were quietly revolutionary. I began to recognize that the pain I had endured was not a weakness, but a catalyst, forcing me to examine my life, my priorities, and my worth, and to take steps that ensured my future would never again be compromised by someone else's deception. By the time I felt fully capable of standing on my own, I realized that I had transformed. The woman who once trembled at the thought of confrontation had become someone who could face reality, absorb the pain, and rise with dignity and grace. Every step I took was deliberate, intentional, and empowering, a testament to my resilience and a reminder that while betrayal had altered my life, it had not destroyed it. I had taken the chaos and turned it into a foundation for growth, strength, and self-respect, and for the first time in a long time, I felt fully alive again. It took months, but eventually I reached a place where the constant ache in my chest had softened, where the sharp edges of betrayal had dulled enough that I could think without crying, and I realized that closure wasn't something Michael could give me. It was something I had to claim for myself. I spent long evenings reflecting on the months of heartbreak, the sleepless nights, the quiet panic, and the moments when I had doubted my own worth, and I finally understood that every tear I shed, every sleepless night, and every pang of despair had led me here, to a place of clarity, strength, and understanding. Closure wasn't forgetting. It wasn't pretending the pain never happened. It was acknowledgement, acceptance, and the quiet, unwavering decision to reclaim my life. I forgave myself first, for trusting too easily, for ignoring instincts, and for allowing fear to keep me silent when my heart knew the truth. That forgiveness was crucial. It allowed me to separate my worth from his choices, to understand that betrayal was never a reflection of who I was but of the life he had chosen to live. I also allowed myself to feel gratitude, strange as it seemed, for the lessons embedded in the pain, the importance of boundaries, the necessity of independence, the value of emotional honesty, and the irreplaceable knowledge that I could endure heartbreak and emerge whole. I began to set firm boundaries, not just with him, but with everyone in my life, creating space for relationships and interactions that uplifted me rather than drained me. I realized that self-respect wasn't about pride or stubbornness. It was about protecting my emotional space and refusing to let anyone diminish my sense of self again. I smiled more freely, laughed without reservation, and even allowed myself to imagine a future where trust was rebuilt, carefully, intentionally, with people who truly valued me. The apartment felt lighter, more like a home than a trap, and I filled it with reminders of my independence. New furniture I had chosen for myself, plants I nurtured with patience, and even small rituals that celebrated my resilience. Morning coffee rituals, evening walks, and journaling sessions that were entirely for me. Each action reinforced the lesson that while betrayal had been devastating, it could not define me, and my life was mine to shape, regardless of what Michael had done. I also reflected on love and relationships differently, understanding that intimacy and connection are built on trust, transparency, and mutual respect, and that ignoring the signs or compromising self-respect in the name of love is a dangerous path. I promised myself that in the future, I would choose partners who valued honesty over convenience, presence over pretense, and emotional integrity over secrecy. I would never again allow someone else's choices to dictate my happiness, my sense of safety, or my self-worth. In the end, closure wasn't a dramatic moment or confrontation. It was quiet, internal, and profound. profoundly empowering. It was the recognition that I had survived a storm that could have broken me, that I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than I had ever been before. And in that stillness, I finally allowed myself to imagine happiness again, not as an escape from pain, but as a natural consequence of strength, self-respect, and the unwavering belief that my life, my future, and my joy belonged to me, and me alone. After months of quiet strength, reflection, and careful planning, I began to embrace life in a way I hadn't dared to before. The apartment, once heavy with tension and betrayal, now felt like a sanctuary, a space that belonged entirely to me. I filled it with light, with plants, with small comforts that reminded me I was worthy of care, of peace, of joy. Slowly, the routines I had reintroduced, the early morning walks, journaling, yoga, coffee rituals, shifted from coping mechanisms into genuine sources of happiness. I noticed the small things again, the golden sunlight spilling across the city streets, the laughter of strangers in the park, the rhythm of my own heartbeat as I breathed deeply and fully. Life was no longer a burden to survive, but a canvas to shape. I also started pursuing dreams I had sidelined for too long, focusing on my career, enrolling in classes I had always wanted to take, and dedicating myself to passions that brought me fulfillment beyond work and the memories of betrayal. There was a freedom in decision-making that I hadn't experienced in years, the ability to say yes to what felt right and no to what no longer served me. And in that freedom, I discovered confidence I didn't know I had. Friends became my lifeline, each gathering, each honest conversation, reinforcing the understanding that connection, when healthy and authentic, heals faster than solitude ever could. Romance, once tainted by betrayal, became a cautious, patient exploration rather than an urgent need to fill a void. I allowed myself to notice kind gestures, genuine smiles, and thoughtful words, but I measured trust carefully, understanding that it is earned through consistency, respect, and honesty. I no longer feared being alone. I relished it, embracing the time to understand myself fully, to identify the boundaries I would never compromise, and to cultivate resilience in ways that no heartbreak could undo. Financial and personal independence became pillars of my new life. I invested in my future, built savings, and planned long-term goals that weren't tethered to anyone else's decisions. Each small victory, whether paying off a bill on my own, completing a course, or achieving a personal milestone, reminded me that I was capable of thriving, unbound by past mistakes or the shadow of betrayal. I realized that power doesn't always roar. It often whispers through consistent, deliberate steps toward a life that reflects one's values and self-respect. Emotionally, I began to release lingering anger and resentment, not by forgetting the past, but by understanding that my energy was better spent on creating joy than harboring pain. The lessons I learned, the importance of boundaries, the need for honesty, the power of self-worth, became my guiding principles. I noticed a subtle shift in the way I carried myself, a quiet confidence that attracted positive experiences and genuine people into my life, proving that even after betrayal, hope and growth are possible. Slowly, I started dreaming again, imagining a future where love, respect, and trust were abundant, a life filled with adventure, passion, and genuine connection. Each goal, each plan, each step forward was a testament to my resilience, my courage, and my refusal to let the past dictate my happiness. I understood that moving forward didn't mean erasing what happened. It meant embracing life fully, honoring my journey, and allowing myself to flourish in ways I hadn't imagined were possible when heartbreak consumed me. By the time months had passed, I realized that I had reclaimed my life completely. The fear, the suspicion, and the sorrow that once dominated my days had been replaced by strength, clarity, and purpose. I had transformed heartbreak into empowerment, betrayal into a lesson, and pain into a foundation for a future that belonged to me entirely. And as I looked forward, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, but for the way it had forced me to grow, to rebuild, and to discover a depth of strength I hadn't known existed. Looking back, I realized that betrayal, heartbreak, and despair are not endings. They are catalysts, moments that reveal hidden strength, resilience, and clarity we didn't know we possessed. The months of doubt, the sleepless nights, the silent tears in the bathroom, all of it shaped me into someone stronger, someone who understands her own worth, and someone who refuses to let anyone else's choices define her life. I have learned that closure is not given. It is claimed, quietly, intentionally, through patience, self-respect, and the courage to face reality without letting it consume you. Every step I took to rebuild my life, to reclaim my independence, and to honor my emotional well-being has become a testament to that quiet power. I have emerged from the shadow of betrayal with dignity intact, my heart wiser and more self-aware than ever before. I laugh freely again, love cautiously but fully, and walk through my life with the confidence of someone who knows she survived a storm that could have destroyed her entirely. I have learned that the true measure of strength is not in the absence of pain, but in the ability to rise despite it, to rebuild despite loss, and to trust oneself above all else. Each decision I make now, each boundary I set, and each dream I pursue is rooted in that hard-earned clarity clarity and self-love, creating a life that reflects my values, my resilience, and my hope. I also understand now that healing is not linear. There were days I felt weak, moments when grief resurfaced, and nights when loneliness reminded me of what had been lost. But even in those moments, I reminded myself that strength is not the absence of vulnerability, it is embracing it and choosing to continue moving forward anyway. I found joy in small victories, in independence, in quiet reflection, and in the knowledge that I am capable of thriving, not because life is easy, but because I refuse to let betrayal define my journey or diminish my worth. My story is not just about heartbreak or betrayal, it is about resilience, empowerment, and reclaiming one's life. It is a reminder that even when someone you love becomes a stranger, even when the foundation you trusted crumbles, you still have the power to rise, to heal, and to create a life filled with purpose, joy, and integrity. The lessons I learned are universal. Trust your instincts, protect your boundaries, value your worth, and remember that your life is yours to shape, no matter the choices of others. And now, as I close this chapter of my life, I feel a sense of peace I never thought possible months ago. The storm has passed, and though the scars remain, they are reminders of survival, of courage, and of the unwavering belief that even in the darkest times, we are capable of reclaiming our light. Life moves forward, and so do I, stronger, wiser, and fully aware that my happiness is no longer dependent on anyone else. Where are you watching this video from, and what time is it there right now? Tell me in the comments.